So they lost this appeal, and James ended up doing 3 years in prison. And again, like I said, this completely colored Dan as far as how he felt about attorneys and how he felt about the government. And so he was very, very adamant. He did not want to work with companies where attorneys were involved. He just didn't trust that thing anymore. And Dan went right back to doing what he was doing. And he was starting to build his name in the speaking industry. And he was doing very well. Unfortunately, the amount of credit card debt that came from trying to get James out of jail was too much, and Dan ended up having to file bankruptcy. But Dan was doing better and better in the speaking business, and he actually grew his income in the speaking business to around $200,000 a year. And ultimately, James got out of prison. James came to Phoenix, and they took off right where they had left off. Created the same program, started selling the same program, and they were immediately again doing $1 million a month. Dan said it was almost like nothing ever happened. The problem is Dan was very fearful of government intervention. And so for anyone to invest in the company, to buy the $4,997 package, they had to sign a disclaimer that stated they knew that James had been in prison and that they were buying into the program anyway. And what they were buying is they were buying the cassettes, and everything else was a bonus. So what they were getting for their money was the cassettes. And what Dan stated was basically, we're not taking anyone's money unless they sign this disclaimer. And Dan said within months, James kind of reverted back to what he was doing before. And he was taking private investment money from people, and he was also having people invest in this thing, and they were not signing disclosures. And Dan warned him a number of times, and then at one point Dan said, you know what, I've had enough of this. I'm out of this company. I don't want you to put any of my information in your products. You're not allowed to use my name. You're not allowed to use my likeness. And within a few months, the same thing happened to James as before. This time he was basically put out of business. And so Dan went back to the speaking business. He went back to making $200,000 a year, and he was doing very, very well. He was able to get gigs. He was able to put people in seminars. He was able to sell product, and he was really learning how to do this. And Dan decided he was going to go to the National Speakers Association and learn how to do it right. And, you know, just as a side note, a lot of people do this. They learn how to do something, and then later on they go back and try and figure out how to really do it. And, you know, I've done that so many times in what I was doing. But Dan went to NSA, and he was just shocked. He got to NSA, and what he found was that everyone there was making no money. He said they were making either no money or they were making like $30,000 a year. And he was making $200,000 a year. And none of them were doing anything that he was doing. And they were all talking about ways to charge, how much to charge. And Dan was charging more than all of these people for speaking. And so Dan was there for like 3 days. And he left, and he was very dejected. And he was at the airport. And he ran into a guy who was a celebrity who had been at the NSA meeting. And the guy was Buster Crabbe. And they were sitting here. And Buster said, Dan, what did you think of the meeting? And Dan said, well, you know, I didn't like the meeting at all. You know, I've got this speaking business. I'm making $200,000 a year. No one in that place was making that kind of money, and I really didn't learn anything. And Buster had the same exact experience. He said, you know, I'm in the exact same boat. You know, I was a celebrity. I'm making very, very good money speaking. I went to learn more techniques and didn't learn anything. And while they were sitting here talking, Buster ended up hiring Dan to help him with his speaking business, and he gave Dan $900. And when he did that, a eureka moment for Dan. Dan said, wait a minute, I can put people in the speaking business. I can teach people how to make money speaking. So when Dan got home, Dan actually rented the mailing list for the NSA, and there were like 1,500 people on this list. And he sent them all a letter offering to sell them a newsletter for the speaking business, and like 300 people gave him $197 for the newsletter. So he got like $60,000 or something like that from sending out this mailing. And what he did, instead of just sending the newsletter to the people who paid for it, what Dan did is he sent the newsletter to all 1,500 of them. He created a newsletter for the speaking business. Instead of just sending it to the people who had bought, he sent it to all of them. And what he started doing is he started giving them great content as far as how to get speaking opportunities, how to get speaking gigs, how to charge. And while he was doing that, in that newsletter, he was selling content in the form of cassettes, he was selling workshops, he was selling coaching, and he was selling seminars. And this basically put Dan in the speaking business, teaching other people how to speak. And when this worked out very, very well, Dan actually ended up creating about 6 different newsletters. And when Dan's talking in the coaching and consulting boot camp, he said that about all of the money that he had brought in, he could attribute to the newsletter business. And so Dan was doing very, very well in the speaking business. He was running seminars. He was actually creating content. He was selling that. And then ultimately, Dan ended up with a large body of work that he had created. And he ended up making a deal with Michael Kimball. And my understanding is this was like a $4 million opportunity. Michael basically gave Dan around $4 million for all of the resale rights of all of his products. And so what happened is they made this deal in around 1996 or 97. And the deal was basically, Dan would create product. Dan would sell that product to his own list for 12 months. And at the end of 12 months, that product would revert to Kimball. And Kimball could sell the product. He could sell resale rights to the product. He could sell master resale rights to the product. So after forming this relationship with Michael Kimball, Dan ended up actually going to work with Peter Lowe. And what they did is, this was at the very, very beginning of the Peter Lowe events. And Dan started working with Peter Lowe. And what they did is they created Magnetic Marketing. And it was a $297 product. And they actually started going and doing tours. And they were doing major coliseums. And Dan worked the Peter Lowe events for 9 years. And for 9 years straight, they sold $1 million worth of Magnetic Marketing. And of course, Dan got half of that money. And so for 9 years, Dan was making $500,000 a year in Magnetic Marketing. And he did that for quite a while. And at the end of 9 years, Dan decided to quit because he didn't like being on the road all the time. And Dan wanted to start creating more of his own events and more of his own content. And so what Dan did is Dan, quit the Peter Lowe events. He started doing super conferences, and he was doing a few of these a year. And while he was doing these super conferences, what he started doing is he started helping people who wanted to be in the seminar business. And so what's interesting about this, if someone wanted to be in the seminar business, Dan would help them get in the seminar business. And not only would he help them with the seminar, he would write the copy for the event. He would create all of the promotion for the event. And he did this with a lot of people. He did it with Rory Fatt. He did it with Yannick Silver. He did it with Joe Polish. And so Dan planted a lot of people in the seminar business. And while Dan was doing that, he was also growing his mailing list. He was also selling coaching. He was doing quite a few different things. And around 2002, Dan was getting a little bit tired because he didn't feel like the events were bringing in enough money. It was a lot of work. And you want to keep in mind, when Dan was doing the events, he was doing all of these other things too. He was doing copywriting, he was doing coaching, and he was also speaking for other people. And so he said that, doing the events was always an opportunity just to make a very large payday a few times a year, because he wasn't using affiliates. He was only making that offer through his own list. And he was actually getting a little bit dejected because it was a lot of work when he met Bill Glazer. And Bill Glazer came in and they met for lunch one day, and they were talking, and Bill had actually used magnetic marketing and had done very, very well in the clothing industry. And they basically were going back and forth, and I think Bill convinced Dan to bring Bill into the company. Bill would basically buy the company for $3 million. And what Bill would then do is he would build the seminar business, he would build the product business, and Dan could focus on what Dan wanted to do, which was the coaching and things like that. And ultimately, that's what happened. So around 2002, Bill Glazer came in, and they formed GKIC. GKIC, or Glazer Kennedy Inner Circle, had a lot of different things that they did. The first thing they did is they had a super conference in the spring, and they had an info summit in the fall. So they had two major events. They had a newsletter that had many, many different levels. So you had Gold, you had Gold Plus, you had VIP, VIP Plus, Platinum. And in addition to the newsletter that they sold, they also had coaching at a number of different levels the same way. And they also did copywriting for companies, and they did major promotions for companies. So GKIC was doing very, very well. Dan did a couple of seminars on coaching and consulting, and Dan really put a ton of people into the coaching business as well. So if you look at what Dan did, he put a ton of people into the speaking business, he put a ton of people in the seminar business, and he also put a ton of people in the coaching business. He created a lot of trainings around all of that, and Dan did very well with all of that. And Glazer Kennedy did very, very well for many, many years. And then around 2011, Bill ended up selling GKIC to an outside group. And they came in, they bought GKIC, and Bill was having a few health issues. So Bill ended up leaving the company. But Dan stayed with GKIC. He still does those GKIC events, the 2 events a year, but he also does a lot of his own events. He also still does copywriting. He also still does coaching. And he also still does a lot of these major promotions for other companies. And so what I'm going to do for a few minutes is we're going to talk about some of the bigger clients that Dan ended up working with. So one of the companies Dan ended up doing a lot of work with that really, really helped Dan grow his company and grow his brand was Guthy-Renker. And I'm going to kind of tell you how that happened. Bill Guthy and Greg Rinker, they were in the cassette duplication business. They were selling cassettes to gurus. They were selling cassettes to people who were name brands, and these people were selling lots and lots and lots of cassettes. And Dan was also in the tape duplication business. Dan at the time owned General Cassette. And so Dan had actually met with Guthy-Renker a few times, and he was hoping to sell them General Cassette because, the company was struggling. He wasn't doing very well. And he ultimately didn't end up selling General Cassette to them, but they became friends. And Guthy-Renker decided they were going to get into the infomercial business because a lot of their clients were making a lot of money selling a lot of cassettes through infomercials. And when they did that, they basically had a product, a Think and Grow Rich Napoleon Hill product that they were going to be selling. And because Dan was in that space, they brought Dan in as a consultant. And this product was very, very successful. And shortly thereafter, they did the product with Anthony Robbins. And Dan was instrumental in actually getting that put together as well. And because they had a number of successes early, and Dan was a part of the deal, they didn't want to let go of Dan, and Dan ended up working with them on pretty much every infomercial. And he would either A, he would be part of the copywriting team, or B, he would be a sounding board and a consultant. And anytime they were going to release something, they wanted Dan's input. Now, when Guthy-Renker went to the consumables business, they started working with a lot of celebrities. And because Dan was involved in this process, Dan got to meet a lot of celebrities. And this caused him to end up working with Joan Rivers, and later on Joan Rivers' daughter Melissa, and a lot of other celebrities as well. And in addition to that, they basically planted Dan as a name brand in the infomercial industry. And so Dan was actually not only working with Guthy-Renker, he was also working with other infomercial marketers. And so what happened, he was working with all these celebrities, he's doing these other infomercials, and when Dan started doing these info summits and super conferences where he would have a celebrity show up, he had a place where he could actually go and get those now. He had an in. Because if he didn't know someone, he would know someone who knew them. And that would get him a lot of meetings with these people. And that's kind of how Dan, was able to get in the infomercial business and also get a lot of celebrities to show up to Info Summit and Super Conference. Now, in addition to that company, Dan also worked with Weight Watchers International, and he and Bill did a lot of work with Miracle Ear. And what happened with Miracle Ear is they contacted Dan and they wanted copywriting. And Dan said, let me take a look at what you're doing. Took a look at what they were doing and said, you don't just need copywriting. You need a complete overhaul of your marketing system. And you need scripts for your salespeople. And this ended up being a $2 million assignment. And Dan talked a lot about assignments and copywriting, and a lot of people would come to Dan and want him to write copy, and Dan didn't just listen to what the person wanted. He would take a look at everything they were doing, and he would say, well, maybe you need copywriting, and maybe you need something else. And if they needed something else, he would actually put that in front of them. And Dan was always looking for a way to extend a relationship. And so if someone wanted copywriting, he was always looking for a way to maybe extend that and do a little bit more work with that person. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shift gears, and what I want to do now is I want to talk about some things that are attitudinal. I want to tell you where Dan got some of his mindset, because what Dan's doing is very, very interesting, and there are some things that shape Dan, and I think that people need to know where this all came from. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, the consulting days, getting paid in advance, and all of those things. I'm going to tell you where that came from. Dan read a book called J.J. Arms' Private Investigator, and it really affected the way Dan thought about what he was doing. And J.J. Arms was a private investigator from California, and he was famous. And just to tell you his backstory a little bit, J.J. Arms, when he was 12 years old, he was walking on a railroad track. And to make railroads, the government would use torpedoes, and they would blow up a section, they would lay track, they would blow up another section, and they would lay more track. Well, J.J. Arms picked up this box that he found on the railroad, and it was a torpedo, and when he opened it, he blew his hands off. And his friend rushed him to the hospital, and they were able to save him, but he lost his hands. And he grew up and became one of the most famous private investigators in the world. And one of the things that he did that made him famous is that he solved the Marlon Brando kidnapping in 24 hours. So Marlon Brando was hugely famous at the time. His son was kidnapped, and J.J. Arms solved that crime in 24 hours. And that really put him on the map, and that caused a lot of other people to want to work with him. Now, J.J. Arms, he had this basic overall belief that if you hire me, I'm going to work the case until it's solved. That was his mindset. And Dan kind of got lifetime guarantee from that. and, really going above and beyond the call of duty, because he felt like, if this guy's going to work a case until it's solved, Dan could do something similar to that. And so what Dan would do is everything he was selling, he made a lifetime guarantee. They ultimately made a TV show based on J.J. Arms, and it was called Nero Wolfe. And if you go and watch Nero Wolfe, it's about a private detective who is kind of a hermit. The guy lives in his house. He very rarely comes out of his house. You don't have access to him by phone. You don't have access to him by email. The only way you can contact him is through a series of events. And then what you have to do, if you're going to work with him, you bring a check for $100,000. You bring the check for $100,000, you put it on his table, you tell him your story, and then overnight Nero Wolfe would decide if he was going to cash your check and work on your case. And that had a profound impact on Dan. And it caused Dan to basically require payment up front, where a lot of people were not doing that. And it also created these consulting days, where a person would basically go through a bunch of hoops, and they would ultimately bring Dan a large check, and he would decide if he was going to take them on as a client. And that's kind of the attitude and the mindset, and a lot of that came from J.J. Arms' private investigator. Now, a lot of the takeaway selling actually came from Gary Halbert. And I'm going to explain what takeaway selling is. I'm going to show you how Dan uses it, and then we're going to tell you how Gary Halbert used it. So takeaway selling is putting something in front of someone and then pulling it away from them and making them jump through a bunch of hoops to get what it is that you have to offer. And the reason for this is the more hoops someone jumps through, the more badly they want something. And so by the time they jump through 6 or 7 hoops, they really want to work with the person. So I'll tell you Dan's process. If you want to hire Dan, the first thing that you do is you call his office in Phoenix. Now, Dan actually lives in Cleveland, but you can't call Dan in Cleveland. You can't call Dan directly at all. He doesn't have a cell phone, and no one can call his home phone, and he doesn't have email. So the only way to get a hold of him is to call Phoenix, and you will talk to his secretary. And you will say, I want to hire Dan for copywriting, or whatever it is you want to hire him for. And what she will say is she will say, okay, I need you to send us a fax that's handwritten that tells us about your business, what it is you do, how you do it, and what you want to hire Dan for. And once you fax that, I'm going to send you a box of things to go over, and we're going to schedule a 5-minute call with Dan. So this is the first step. The first step is you call Phoenix and you talk to his secretary. The second step is you fax some information. You can't even mail it. The third step is you get a box of stuff from Dan and you go through it. And then they schedule a 5-minute call with Dan. So Dan calls, you have a 5-minute call with Dan, and then you schedule a consulting day. And before you can hire Dan for any kind of work, you have to have a consulting day. And I think that's around $20,000 or something like that now. And so once you've had the consulting day, you pitch Dan on actually taking your copywriting assignment or coaching assignment or whatever it is. And Dan decides if he's going to work with you. Now this is all takeaway selling. Now I want you to think about something. People go through hoop after hoop after hoop just to get him on the phone. By the time people get him on the phone, what do they want to do? They want to hire Dan, and I'll tell you why. If they don't hire Dan while he's on the phone, if they don't agree to the consulting day, they go back to the beginning of the line and they have to go through all these hoops again. And Dan learned this takeaway from Gary Halbert. And so Gary Halbert was doing a $7,000 seminar in South Beach, Florida. And he had 800 people pay $7,000 to be at the event. And Dan was actually at the event. He was going to be a speaker. Gary Halbert shows up 10 minutes late for his own event. And he walks in wearing shorts, flip-flops, a tank top, and he was wearing a hat that said clients suck. And he walked up on stage, and for the next 30 minutes he said, you can't hire me, I don't want any more clients, I don't want to work with clients, they're a pain to work with, and so don't even talk to me about hiring me because you just can't, you're not going to get me to work with you. And Dan was amazed by this, and when they had a second in the green room, Dan said, Gary, that's awesome, you're doing really well, so you don't need clients at all? And Gary said, no, I need clients really bad, that's exactly why I did this. And for the next 3 days, every person in that room was following Gary around, trying to convince Gary to take their money. They were trying to convince him to take their copywriting assignment. And that's kind of where Dan got takeaway selling from. So the next thing we're going to talk about here for a few minutes is the 4-step email sequence that Dan used. And the 4-step mail sequence, I'm going to tell you where he got that. You know, when Dan ran into problems with all of the financing that he did to get Tullison out of jail, he ran up all of that credit card debt, and he was getting hounded by a lot of collection agencies. And he found they were sending him a first notice, a second notice, a third notice, and then a final notice with the first 3 that he'd ignored stapled to it. And that's where Dan learned the 4-step mail sequence. And so what Dan did, when Dan rented the NSA mailing list, he got Avery labels, and he printed Avery labels with everyone's name and address, and he printed 4 labels on a piece of paper. So he had books of labels, and each book, each label, there were 4. So he went through and he tore all of the first labels off. He mailed his first letter. If someone responded to that letter, he took them out of the sequence. He went to their labels and took their labels out. If someone didn't respond to that first letter, he went to the second set of labels and sent them a second letter. And if they responded to the second letter, he went to that Avery label system, pulled their information out so they wouldn't get a third letter. If they didn't respond, he sent them a third letter. And this is how Dan learned the 4-step letter sequence. This is kind of where he learned it. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to end out at this point. I really think I've given you all some insights as to how, Dan got his start, the progression of things. But I appreciate you all watching, and thanks a lot.